Welcome back to 4547blog.com presents the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ, and tonight we're not here to relitigate some stupid campaign slogan or trade memes. We're definitely not here to pretend that the last year didn't matter either. Tonight, we're going to slow down and talk honestly about Donald Trump's first year in office, what he actually accomplished, what he disrupted, what worked, and why year one tells you more about a presidency than any speech ever could. It's because actions over words. It's actions matter, words don't. Lou Holtz once said, after all is said and done, more has been said than done. And I love that quote. It's because the first years matter, guys. They reveal priorities. They expose intent. They show whether the president governs for headlines or for direction. Trump's first year wasn't polished. It wasn't quiet as usual. And it sure wasn't designed to make Washington comfortable at all. But it was decisive. Borders were no longer theoretical. Regulation was no longer sacred. The courts are no longer ignored. It's energy, trade, enforcement. Everything that had been stalled by inertia suddenly started moving again. That didn't happen by accident. At the same time, we're not going to pretend it was flawless. There were messaging failures. There were self-inflicted distractions. There were moments where execution lagged behind intent. And if conservatism is going to be serious, if it's going to govern, we have to be honest about both. This show isn't about worshiping Donald Trump like the left says. It's about results. So tonight, we're going to walk through Trump's first year the way adults should. What changed? What endured? What was overhyped? And what these liberal critics still refuse to acknowledge. We'll compare it to other presidents' first years. We'll separate media narrative from measurable outcomes. And we'll ask the question that actually matters now. Did Trump's first year reset the country's direction? Or just shake the fucking room up? Because whether you supported him, opposed him, or are still undecided, one thing is undeniable. Year one set the tone for everything that's going to follow. And understanding it is the only way to understand where we're headed next. That's what we're doing tonight. This is the New Conservative Radio Show, and let's get into it. So for years, Americans were told the border was complex, that enforcement was cruel, that interior law enforcement was somehow optional. Well, folks, that era is thankfully over. What we're seeing now isn't radical, it's restoration. Border and interior enforcement have been fully reinstated. Not as a political stunt, but as a recognition of reality. A nation that can enforce its laws cannot pretend to be sovereign. Mass interior enforcement is back, guys, not because anyone enjoys it, but because ignoring violations doesn't make them disappear. It compounds them. For years, the message was simple and super destructive. If you make it inside, the law stops applying. That wasn't compassion. That was abandonment of citizens, of communities, and of legal immigrants who followed the rules to get here the proper way. That message has been reversed. Asylum abuse, one of the most cynical loopholes in modern policy, is being destroyed. It's not eliminated for those who genuinely need the protection, but it's being stripped of its function as a fast pass for fraud. And all these fraudulent people coming to our border and just saying, hey, my neighborhood is dangerous, I need asylum. When every claim is treated as sacred, the system freaking collapses. When the system collapses, the truly vulnerable people who need it are buried underneath the abuse. Restoring standards, it's not heartless. It's how you preserve mercy for those who actually qualify. Federal-state cooperation has been restored in a large majority of states. The artificial wall between Washington and local enforcement, the one built for politics, not public safety, that's coming down underneath the Trump administration. States are no longer being told to look the other way. Sheriffs aren't being punished for doing their jobs. Federal law is being treated as law again, not as a suggestion for the most part. We all know the places that don't apply, but for the majority of America, this is true. This isn't about targeting people. It's about ending the lie that borders don't matter, laws don't matter, and enforcement is somehow immoral. What's happening now is not chaos, it's correction. Now let's slow down and, talk about the numbers, because numbers don't care about narratives. In Donald Trump's first year back in office, what changed most wasn't the rhetoric, it was the results. According to figures released by the Department of Homeland Security over the past year, unauthorized border encounters dropped sharply to roughly 444,000 total encounters. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural shift, and it puts crossings at levels we haven't seen in decades. The drop didn't happen because the economy changed overnight or because geography moved. It happened because policy changed. Enforcement signals change. Consequences returned to the United States of America, and interior enforcement also changed. DHS is reporting hundreds of thousands of removals over the last year. The interior removals once again making up a significant share of these numbers, something we haven't seen consistently in years. That tells you the law wasn't just enforced at the line, it was enforced inside the country, where deterrence actually sticks. Look at the monthly data, and it gets even clearer. In late 2025, monthly illegal crossing attempts fell into the single-digit thousands, numbers that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. In some months, attempts were down more than 80% compared to the same period, last year. That doesn't happen by accident, and we all know it. Critics will argue about the definition or the motive or the tone, and that's fine. But here's the reality you should take away. When the federal government stopped advertising loopholes, the flow slowed. When asylum abuse was taken out of the picture, the system was stabilized. When states and federal agencies worked together instead of at odds with each other, the enforcement became predictable again. It wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Trump's first year back proved something Washington spent years denying, that you don't need new laws to restore order to the border. You just need the will to enforce the ones you already have. And when that will returned to America, the numbers also followed. It's not ideology, it's evidence. When people hear that agencies were downsized or offices were eliminated in 2025, the reaction is usually emotional. These liberals, their words are, oh, they dismantled, or they gutted, or it's authoritarian, like we've heard that a million times. But these words get thrown around before anyone asks the most important question: what problem was this meant to solve? Because these changes didn't happen in isolation. They fit into a much larger reform effort aimed at a core issue, that the federal government had grown too big, too slow, and it's too detached from accountability to even exist anymore, or for it to be okay for people who support MAGA to exist. So for decades, Washington expanded by default, the programs multiplied, offices were created for every new priority under the sun. Very few of these ever even went away. The result wasn't government. It wasn't governance. It was like overlap. It was redundancy. The agencies doing work that no longer matched their original mission. Trump's 2025 reforms took a different approach. Instead of asking, how do we add another office, the administration says, does this office still need to even exist at all? Instead of protecting every freaking structure out of habit of being a governmental agent, he evaluated the function, the authority, and the necessity of these so-called agencies, That's why the focus wasn't just on cutting budgets, it was on reorganizing power, and this is why the liberals are choosing the word authoritarian. Smaller agencies and advisory bodies that duplicated work of other bodies, they operated far from congressional oversight, and they existed largely as grant distribution hubs. And those things were reduced, they were consolidated, and they were ordered to wind down, not because culture was under attack, but because governance had it had drifted away from efficiency and clarity. The same logic applied to large departments also. Health agencies were consolidated to reduce bureaucratic sprawl. Education staff was reduced as authority was pushed back towards states. The right to educate was given back to the states. Housing and social service offices were examined to separate direct assistance from administrative bloat. This wasn't about eliminating the government. It was about shrinking the distance between decision makers and voters and getting rid of the unnecessary money spent within every single process that the government has. And we all know it exists, and the liberals just choose not to acknowledge it right now because Trump is in office. That theme runs through everything else the administration did in 2025. The Schedule F restored accountability over policy influencing roles. Hiring freezes slowed automatic growth. Voluntary exits reduced payroll without mass firings. The agency heads regained authority over their own departments this last year. So put together what wasn't chaos, it was a shift in philosophy. It's like getting bought by a new company and then that new company coming through and kind of implementing its philosophy. And this is how the presidency is always supposed to work, but somehow the agencies of America have moved away from that. And the Supreme Court has kind of given that power back slowly to the president. The federal government is being stripped of its power to behave like a permanent institution that governs regardless of the election. And it's starting to behave more like, a branch of the executive that reflects electoral outcomes, which it's supposed to. Critics are going to argue that this threatens the stability, but stability without accountability isn't stability, it's, stagnation. Real reform always looks disruptive. Because it interrupts the systems that have learned how to sustain themselves without delivering results. The broader theme of Trump's 2025 reform is simple. Even if the execution is complex to some people, it is this. Government should be limited, accountable, responsible, and subordinate to the Constitution, not isolated from it. And whether you support every cut or not, one thing is undeniable. For the first time in years, Washington wasn't expanding on autopilot. It was being forced to justify itself. That's not dismantling democracy. It's testing whether it still works. Now, one of the most measurable aspects of the Trump administration's first year back in office is energy dominance. It was backed by real production and export figures, not a bunch of slogans. According to the federal data and the industry reporting, U.S. oil and gas production continued at record levels in 2025. Crude oil output hit about 13.6 million barrels per day, making the United States the world's largest producer once again, ahead of the competitors like Saudi Arabia and Russia. Natural gas also reached roughly 107 billion cubic feet per day in total production. That's an enormous supply based on which exports and domestic uses both draw. Now, turn to exports. Especially liquefied natural gas in 2025, the U.S. LNG exports were on pace to surpass 100 million metric tons for the first time ever. Early reports suggest the United States exported roughly 111 million metric tons of LNG during the first year of Trump's presidency, or of his second term, making it the global leader in LNG shipments and well ahead of traditional suppliers like Qatar. So that matters on multiple fronts. First, that record export level, it reflects the global demand for U.S. energy from Europe to Asia, and it underscores how rapidly American gas capacity has grown. It also signals how Trump's policies helped clear regulatory barriers that had previously slowed the export approvals for all of our gas or all of our energy components that we export. And as we all know, the numbers don't lie. LNG shipments grew at a double-digit pace year over year, with many terminals reporting increases of 20% or more compared to 2024 levels. The surge in shipments was supported by increasing feed gas volumes. The data showed that December 2025 alone averaged around 19.26 billion cubic feet per day flowing into export facilities. Let's put that into context. Just a few years earlier, exports were growing but never exceeded 70 million tons in a first year. Pushing beyond 100 million metric tons with monthly records exceeding 10 million tons reflects a structural shift in the United States' role in the global energy or on the global energy stage. That export strength, in turn, it feeds back into domestic production incentives. The producers see demand overseas and they invest in drilling and infrastructure here at home, which supports jobs and energy security. Critics, they point to price volatility and they argue exports, they raise domestic costs. And that's a discussion worth having, but you can't deny the scale of production and the export growth. These aren't abstract policy outcomes. These are real numbers measured by millions of tons and billions of cubic feet of LNG. Under Trump's leadership in 2025, America didn't just talk about energy dominance. It produced more, it exported more, and it cemented its position in the world's as a world leading oil and gas powerhouse. That's not a theory. That's measurable reality once again. And that brings me to this. It's, one of the most consequential and least understood changes in Trump's first year back in office. And it's what happened inside the Department of Justice and the FBI. It wasn't through speeches, but it was through structure. In early 2025, the administration, it ordered internal accountability reviews across federal law enforcement agencies, and the purpose was straightforward. It was to examine whether prosecutorial power and investigative tools had been used consistently or selectively. That review wasn't about relitigating politics. It was about restoring confidence in institutions that had been lost through the public. The public doesn't trust them anymore. They're lost in what they're doing. The public sees that, and nobody trusts them. But at the same time, the DOJ, they launched formal inquiries into political biasness as a process. So review teams were asked to examine charging decisions and investigative thresholds, I guess, in internal approval chains in politically sensitive cases. The goal wasn't to stop prosecutions. It was to ensure that prosecutions were defensible in evidence and not aligned with some kind of freaking ideology. That led to a third shift, which was narrowing the prosecutorial discretion. In 2025, the DOJ guidance tightened when and how federal prosecutors can bring charges, especially in cases that involve public officials or elections or some kind of speech-adjacent conduct. The long-standing internal gatekeeping functions, they were revised. They were, with the charging decisions they were elevated for senior review. Prosecutors were instructed to focus on the most provable offenses and to avoid novel legal theories that stretch the statutes beyond their plain meaning. Critics call it interference. The supporters call it resistant. Because discretion without limits isn't independent, it's power without accountability. These reforms also coincide with charges that are charges to internal oversight. So inspector generals were replaced or restructured, and review mechanisms were consolidated under leadership aligned with the administration and their stated policies. So courts weighed in on this process, but the direction was clear. The DOJ and the FBI were being reminded that they sit inside the executive branch, not above it. So the broader theme of tying all this together is the administration wasn't trying to make law enforcement weaker. It was trying to make it predictable standards, predictable charging decisions, predictable lines between policy and politics and prosecution. Because when the public believes justice is some kind of arbitrary or partisan, the system it doesn't deter any kind of crime. It destabilizes the country altogether. Trump's 2025 reforms, they reflect a philosophy that says law enforcement must be independent enough to enforce the law, but accountable enough to never become the law itself. That balance is hard. It's controversial and it's uncomfortable, but it's also necessary because the justice system people don't trust can't hold a nation together no matter how many cases it brings against anyone, politicians, law enforcement agents, or the civilians itself. That's what this moment is really about. It's not protecting politicians. It's not punishing opponents, but rebuilding the legitimacy of the federal justice itself. And to understand why these reforms matter, you have to step back from the moment and look at history, because it isn't the first time America has wrestled with the power of federal law enforcement. After Watergate, the country swung hard in one direction. Trust in the presidency, it collapsed completely, and Congress responded by building guardrails around the DOJ and the FBI. New norms emerged after that. Internal review layers multiplied, prosecutorial discretion widened, on the theory that independence meant insulation from politics. But those changes were understandable at the time. The goal was to prevent another Nixon. But guardrails can quietly become walls, and over the decades that followed, independence drifted away from autonomy, and autonomy drifted into permanence, and permanence drifted into a culture where unelected officials, they learned they could shape outcomes regardless of who won the election. And President Trump noticed, and Obama also noticed. Biden benefited from it, but Trump challenged it. And the difference is that in 2025, Trump didn't just complain about the system, he acted on it. Compare that to the Clinton era, where DOJ discretion expanded but accountability mechanisms were rarely tested, or the Obama years when prosecutorial power was just aggressively in regulatory and civil contexts, often through consent decrees and novel legal freaking theories, or the Biden years when the DOJ leadership openly framed enforcement priorities through ideological language. In each case, the discretion, it grew, and the oversight didn't keep pace. What Trump's 2025 reforms represent is a course correction, not a revolution. Instead of assuming prosecutors should decide how far laws can be stretched, the administration narrowed the discretion and elevated review. Instead of trusting internal culture to police itself, it imposed accountability reviews. Instead of preventing the DOJ and FBI exist outside of politics, it reasserted the constitutional reality that they are part of the executive branch. And this isn't unpredictable. Presidents from Andrew Jackson to Franklin Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan, they all confronted bureaucracies that had outgrown their original mandate or their original intent. Each responded differently, but all recognize the same danger. A government that governs itself eventually stops answering to the people. And let's not forget, the similarities between Andrew Jackson, even though he's a Democrat, and Donald Trump, and the way that they are moving through their presidency. But that's for a whole nother show. So the modern federal justice apparatus is larger, more complex, and more insulated than anything the founders ever imagined. So reining it in was never going to be quiet. It was never going to be popular with the institutions that are being reined in. So that's really no surprise what we saw. That's why the reaction, it's been so intense, because history, it teaches us something uncomfortable but true. Every time that the executive authority is reasserted after a long period of bureaucratic drift, it gets called freaking authoritarian until the system stabilizes again. The post-Watergate era wasn't wrong. It wasn't permanent either. Trump's 2025 DOJ and FBI reforms are best understood as a pendulum swinging back towards accountability after decades of swinging towards unchecked discretion, It's not to protect politicians. It's not to punish opponents, but it's there to restore justice and justice to the system that enforces the law evenly, predictably, and within its constitutional lane. History won't judge this moment by the outrage it produced. It'll judge it by whether Americans once again believe in the law and believe it belongs to the people and understand that it's not the institutions that enforce it, but the people that create the laws themselves by, voting people into Congress who create the laws. If you really want to understand what's happening here, you have to go back even further past Watergate, past the modern DOJ, past FBI entirely, to the founders themselves, because the question isn't new. The founders were deeply suspicious of concentrated power, but they were especially wary of unelected power. James Madison warned that liberty is threatened not just by tyranny from above, but by systems that drift beyond control because no one can check them. Alexander Hamilton argued that energy in the executive wasn't a flaw, but a necessity, because a weak executive doesn't protect freedom, it abandons responsibility, and we saw that with President Biden. You see the dramatic difference between what gets done with a pushover president to what gets done with a president that's out there kicking ass for America. And the part that gets lost in modern debate is the Constitution does not create an independent justice branch. There is no fourth branch of government called the permanent bureaucracy. There's no constitutional carve out for prosecutors or investigators to operate beyond electoral accountability. So Article 2 is clear. Executive power is vested in the President of the United States. That means law enforcement answers to the executive, not to culture, not to legacy norms, and not to internal consensus. The founders believed in independence without accountability. It was just another form of tyranny, quiet, administrative, and really, really difficult to remove. They expected friction. They expected tension. They expected presidents to direct the execution of law and to be judged by the people if they abused the power. What they did not expect was a permanent class of officials who would decide which laws mattered, which cases moved forward, and which elections could be quietly overridden by process. Trump's 2025 DOJ and FBI reforms don't break from that constitutional vision. They return to it. So narrowing prosecutorial discretion, it isn't authoritarian, it's restraint. Accountability reviews, they're not political, they're structural. Everybody has reviews. Anybody who has a job has an accountability review. So the politician should be no different. Reasserting executive authority, it isn't corruption, it's constitutional design. That's literally how America is designed, to reassert executive authority each time a new president is elected. The founders didn't fear strong presidents. They feared unaccountable systems, period. And they built elections, not bureaucracies, as the corrective mechanism for these issues. If Americans don't like how the law is being enforced, they can vote the president out. But if they don't like how the entrenched agencies operate, no one can change it. And democracy, it becomes decorative. It just becomes theatrics. That's the core issue beneath all the noise. This moment isn't about Trump versus institutions. It's about who governs. The founders answered that question plainly. The people govern through elections, through accountable executives, through laws passed by Congress and enforced, not interrupted into oblivion by the executive branch. Everything else is drift. And what you're seeing now is an attempt. It's controversial, it's imperfect, and loud to correct that drift before it becomes too permanent. We all know that these bureaucracies have existed for decades. History doesn't preserve freedom by freezing systems in place. It preserves freedom by forcing power to answer to the people again and again. That's not radical, that's American. So let's put real numbers on the table, because trade debates, they get quiet, when the math shows up. So by the time Trump reasserted trade enforcement in the United States, the United States already had tariffs covering roughly 300 to 370 billion worth of Chinese imports under Section 301. Those weren't symbolic fees. Those were strategic pressure, hitting rates between 7.5% and 25%, depending on the sector. And the sectors weren't random either. It was steel, aluminum, machinery, electronics, solar components, batteries, EV supply chains, which is why, Elon threw a little fit, advanced manufacturing inputs. So these were the exact industries China had been flooding with state-subsidized overcapacity while American factories shut the door. Trump didn't apologize for tariffs in 2025. He used them, and the steel tariffs stayed at 25%, aluminum at 10%, anti-dumping enforcement ramped up, customs cracked down on Chinese transshipment schemes that ran through, third world countries to dodge duties, and suddenly cheap imports, they weren't cheap anymore. Once you priced in risk, enforcement and unpredictability, they weren't the cheapest thing anymore. And that's when shift happens, and it did happen. According to the Commerce Department tracking, U.S. manufacturing construction investment surpassed $200 billion annually in 2025, with massive increases concentrated in semiconductors, the energy equipment, automotive components, and advanced materials. These type of manufacturings, they have never taken place, or they really don't take place in America on a large scale, because the components and the raw materials are cheaper to get in other places. But this didn't happen because CEOs got patriotic. It happened because tariffs rewrote the cost equation. Here's the part critics, they hate admitting. Tariffs didn't kill manufacturing. They forced it to come home. When you put 25% tariff on subsidized Chinese steel, or then, domestic producers, they don't need bailouts, they need orders. When you tax manipulated imports, capital moves where rules are predictable, and when the companies realize one political decision in Beijing can shut down their entire the entire supply chain, they stop pretending efficiency is the same thing as resilience. They're trying to save a buck, but they can get completely shut down overnight if Beijing doesn't agree with their manufacturing, or doesn't agree with just any old thing. They can just shut you down for whatever. That is not a risk that a lot of businesses are calculating into their business plan, and I don't think it's something that they are willing to take anymore. So, look at the LNG equipment, or look at battery plants, or look at the chip fabs, look at industrial tooling. These sectors expanded because tariffs acted like a filter. They were cutting out artificial price advantages, and that were created by the Chinese foreign government, letting real market competition exist again. Here's the key distinction Washington ignored for decades. It's that tariffs aren't punishment, they're leverage, and they stayed in place until behavior changed. They targeted industries tied to national security, and they made offshoring risky instead of fashionable and profitable to just be here in America. That's why reshoring accelerated, not because of speeches, but because tariffs made dependence expensive. For years, Americans were told tariffs were taxes on customers. What they never mentioned is the tax we were already paying. Lost jobs, hollowed out towns, fragile supply chains, and strategic vulnerability. Tariffs flipped that script. They protected hundreds of billions of dollars of domestic production. They're anchoring investment inside the U.S., and they're forcing corporations to stop treating China as a guaranteed partner instead of what it is, a competitor that cheats the rest of the world. This is what real trade enforcement is supposed to look like. You want access to the U.S. market? Play by our rules. If you want to dump subsidized goods, pay the price so you're not destroying American industries. If you want to hollow out American industry, piss off. Not anymore. Tariffs didn't weaken the economy. They replaced it. They rebalanced it. And in 2025, Trump made it clear that America will trade, but it will no longer trade away its leverage, its workers, or its industrial base for cheap imports and polite excuses. That's not protectivism. That's economic self-defense. Let's go rapid fire sector by sector. So in the steel department, we have China dumping subsidized steel. America answers with a 25% tariff plus anti-dumping enforcement and crackdowns on Chinese transshipment through third world countries. The result is domestic mills restart and the capacity rises and the imports of steel fall. Next is autos. So China undercuts parts of the auto industry with state subsidies. The U.S. tightens rules of origin and keeps tariffs pressure on components. The result was supply chains shift back to North America, anchoring engines, drive chains, and better assembly closer to home so that Americans eventually will pay less. Chips. China targets tech dominance, and America responds with export controls, investment screening, and tariff risk that makes China-centric sourcing dangerous. The result is billions flow into U.S. fabrication and advanced packaging. Security beats cheap labor. And then energy, China floods markets with subsidized solar and equipment, and the U.S. enforces tariffs and expands LNG exports, replacing Chinese supply abroad. The result is record LNG shipments and growth in the United States energy manufacturing. Tariffs weren't punishment, they were leverage. Sector by sector, China's edge got, priced out. It's getting a little less sharp. Investment came home, and supply chains shortened. Tariffs didn't start a trade war, they ended America's surrender to China. One of the most lasting changes of Trump's presidency also isn't happening on cable news. It's happening quietly in courtrooms where judicial appointments didn't stop when Trump left office. They didn't change when he came back. The strategy stayed the same. Young judges, originalist judges who read the law instead of trying to rewrite it, that, appreciate the Constitution, and that matters more than any freaking press cycle ever would. Trump's judicial picks have been younger than average for decades now. They're like late 40s, early 50s, meaning they're not just shaping the cases today, but they're going to shape the law for a generation. These are lifetime appointments. These are no recall buttons on these guys. There's no news cycle reset for these guys. The philosophy is consistent with Trump. These judges don't treat the Constitution like some kind of suggestion. They don't hunt for hidden meanings. They don't pretend courts exist to update the law when Congress won't do its job. They apply text, structure, and original public meaning. Period. That's why administrative law is changing. For 40 years, federal agencies operated under the doctrine called the Chevron defense, which basically says if Congress votes a vague law, then agencies, not judges, they get to decide what it's meant to mean. And that era, it's over. The Supreme Court killed Chevron. And when that happened, it stripped unelected bureaucracies of the power to invent law through regulation. Now judges interpret statutes, not agencies, not regulators or experts insulated by the voters, or from the voters, I should say. And it didn't stop there. Other doctrines that protected the administrative statute, our defense, nationwide injunctions, independent agency insulation are all under pressure. Courts are demanding clear authorization, clear limits, clear accountability. This is a rebalancing of power. So for decades, Washington operated like it had a fourth branch of government, permanent, unaccountable, and untouchable. But Trump's judges, they're dismantling that idea case by case, not with speeches, but with actual rulings. And critics are calling it radical, but it's the opposite. It's constitutional. Congress writes the law, the executive enforces it, and the courts are there to interpret it. That's not conservative ideology. That's just the system. This is how the system has worked for decades, and I don't understand why the liberals, or where the liberals are pulling this shit out of, but I think we can all kind of get the gist of it, and it's probably somewhere the sun doesn't shine. But Put it together and the picture is clear. Agencies lost difference, regulators lost unchecked authority, and courts reclaimed their role in America. And here's the part that drives the left insane. None of this requires winning another election. These judges are already there. They're already deciding cases, and they're already reshaping how much power Washington can grab without permission. Trump didn't just appoint judges. He appointed limits. Limits on agencies, limits on regulators, limits on government that forgot who it answers to. And this is going to go and stay in place for long after the headlines fade. Those limits are going to be the part that lasts. That's not politics. That's a conservative freaking legacy. And this is where all of it connects, because the same philosophy you just heard about at home showed up overseas too. Foreign policy under Trump returned to a simple idea that Washington had forgotten, which is deterrence first. It's not endless proxy wars. It's not black check commitments. It's not negotiations built on apologies, Compare that to what came before. Under Barack Obama, the United States leaned hard into managed conflict. Afghanistan peaked at nearly 100,000 U.S. troops in 2011, followed by years of drawdowns paired with continued counterinsurgency. Iraq and Syria became long-running proxy environments. Democracy often came first, strength later. If at all, we would just lose people sometimes because democracy and diplomacy played such a freaking big role in a war. And then under Joe Biden, the model shifted even further towards proxy engagement, arming partners, funding conflicts, and managing escalation from, arm's distance. The United States avoided direct confrontation with anyone, but paid for it with tens of billions of dollars instead some sustained aid packages and open-ended commitment postures that critics argued reduced leverage. And it's not just an argument. Anybody who knows anything about a fight knows that if you keep your arm's distance, they can see in your eyes and see how scared you are. But Trump went the other direction. Instead of feeding proxy wars, he reduced exposure. By the end of his first term, U.S. troops, their levels in Afghanistan were cut from about 13,000 to 2,500, the lowest since 2001. Iraq and Syria, they saw similar reductions paired with targeted, determined actions meant to stop escalation, not manage the shit forever. It wasn't isolationism. It was containment by strength, negotiation followed by leverage. Look at North Korea. Maximum sanctions, credible military pressure, and only then direct talks. No concessions up front, no normalization without restraint. And then look at NATO. Trump demands allies pay their freaking share, and they did. Between 2017 and 2020, NATO allies increased defense spending by over $130 billion collectively. That's not rhetoric, that's math. And it's numbers, and they don't lie, and they hate, again, when they show up. It happened because the U.S. support stopped being automatic. No blank checks, no free rides, no deterrence, reduction. No deterrence, it was reduced escalation, okay? When adversaries believed consequences were real, they tested us less. When allies knew support wasn't unconditional, they invested more in their own defense. And when negotiations happened, they happened from a position of strength, not urgency. Obama managed conflict. Biden, he subsidized freaking conflict. And Trump, he deters it. That's the through line. Foreign policy doesn't become softer. With Trump, it became sharper, shorter engagements, clearer red lines, fewer open-ended commitments measured in decades and trillions of freaking dollars. Deterrence first doesn't mean never using force. It means using it rarely and convincingly enough that you don't have to keep using it, like in Venezuela with Maduro. Their freaking president sits in a New York jail waiting court. Like, you think that you can't be touched, we'll come pick you up and we'll just process you like an American citizen. Just like at home, the philosophy is the same. Limit drift, demand accountability, and make strength visible before it's needed. That's not reckless, that's restraint with teeth. Teeth that bite. If you act like you aren't there, or you're not worried about it, or if you get too comfortable taking advantage of America, the teeth can, and now they will come out in one form or another. So, let's talk about something Washington pretended was compassion, but functioned like control, and that's the ideology inside the federal workforce. In 2025, that ended also. The process of boot to ass began. The mandatory DEI mandates were rescinded not because diversity is illegal, but because compelled ideology is. Federal employees were no longer forced to sit through trainings that told them how to think, what to say, or how to label themselves to keep their jobs or others. If a program wasn't grounded in law or job performance, it was gone. That's not censorship. It's neutrality. And neutrality matters in governance because government doesn't get to pick sides in culture wars and then call it policy. Next came hiring. So for years, merit took a backseat to the metrics. Resumes were filtered through identity checklists. Managers were graded on outcomes that had nothing to do with competence. In 2025, that stopped. Merit-based hiring was reinstated. Skills, experience, qualifications, performance, the things that freaking matter in a job. Race, based scorecards were removed. The ideological language disappeared from job descriptions, and equal opportunity went back to meaning equal freaking treatment. And here's the truth nobody wanted to say out loud. When you stop hiring for politics, you start hiring for performance. Then there were the speech codes. Federal agencies had quietly built internal rules that punished lawful speech. They compelled language and blurred the line between professionalism and ideology. Those codes were dismantled. Employees were reminded of something radical in modern Washington in 2025, and that's the First Amendment still applies to every American. You can't force beliefs. You can't mandate speech. You can't punish private viewpoints just because they're unfashionable to you. Harassment stayed illegal. Threats stayed illegal. Workplace standards stayed in place, but vague ideological enforcement, gone. Put it all together and the pattern is clear. This wasn't about silencing anyone. It was about ending compulsion. The federal government stopped acting like a cultural referee and went back to being what it is supposed to be, a neutral administrator of the law. No loyalty oaths except for to the American people. No ideological training wheels. No punishment for unlawful thinking. Critics scream rollback, but what actually happened here? It was a reset. Government got smaller in its opinions, and stronger in its mission. That's not cruelty, that's professionalism, and we need that in America. And when neutrality returned, so did trust, because a government that doesn't tell you what to believe is a government that finally remembers who it freaking works for. So let's end tonight where we should have started, with utter clarity. What you just heard wasn't a campaign rally. It's not nostalgia, and it's not blind loyalty like the libs love to say us, MAGA or Trump supporters are. This is a sober look at what's actually happening in Donald Trump's first year back in office, and why it matters. Year one wasn't about perfection, it was about direction. The border went from abstraction to enforcement. Numbers fell because consequences returned. Asylum went from loophole to standard. Federal and state law enforcement stopped working at cross purposes and started acting like the law was real again. Washington didn't grow quieter, but it did grow more honest, at least the Republican side. The administrative state has been challenged. It's not being worshipped. The agencies were forced to justify their existence instead of assuming permanence. Hiring moved back towards merit. Speech moved back towards freedom. Ideology stopped being mandatory and started being optional. The energy dominance wasn't a slogan. It showed up in barrels, cubic feet, and at export terminals. Trade enforcement wasn't theory. It showed up in factories, fabrication factories, the mills and the ports. Tariffs weren't punishment. They were leverage, and they freaking worked. The justice system was forced back into its constitutional lane. Discretion was narrowed, accountability returned, and courts quietly but permanently started reclaiming authority from unelected regulators. Judges were appointed who didn't see themselves as legislators in robes. Chevron fell. The administrative state lost its shield, and real limits were restored. Foreign policy stopped chasing moral approval and returned to deterrence. Fewer blank checks, clearer red lines, negotiation backed by strength, not apology. And inside the federal workforce, the cultural thermostat finally reset. No more compelled belief, no more ideological enforcement disguised as some kind of professionalism. Neutrality returns to the government, and with it, legitimacy. That's the through line. Not chaos, it's correction. Not cruelty, but boundaries. Not stupid slogans, but structure. And before we close, it's worth recognizing that none of this exists in a vacuum. Movements don't sustain themselves without people willing to do the unglamorous work of building them. That's where Charlie Kirk deserves real credit. Long before politics became fashionable for young conservatives, Charlie stepped into hostile territory on the college campuses, and he refused to surrender that ground. Through Turning Point USA, he helped build one of the most influential conservative youth movements in modern American politics, giving a generation the language, confidence, and infrastructure to engage instead of retreating from these psychopathic liberals, not by hiding from debate, not by apologizing for principles, but by showing up again and again. That work mattered, and it still matters. It shaped voters, activists, and leaders who are now part of the broader reset you've heard about tonight. That's not hype, that's real impact. You don't have to agree with every tactic to respect the contribution, to understand that movements need builders, not just commentators. And Charlie built something that will last news cycles. So when we talk about year one, about direction, we're also talking about the ecosystem that made that direction possible. You don't have to love every decision to recognize the pattern. You don't have to excuse the distractions to see the substance. And you don't have to ignore the flaws to admit something fundamental changed this last year. Trump's first year back didn't solve everything, but it reversed drift. It proved the country wasn't locked into decline. It proved enforcement still works. It proved the bureaucracy can be challenged, and it proved elections still frickin' matter. And maybe the most important thing is it proved that government isn't about making Washington all comfortable. It's about giving the country direction. That's what year one showed us. And understanding that honestly without spin is the only way to understand what comes next. That's it for tonight. This is the New Conservative Radio Show, and I'm NINJ. Stop by 4547blog.com and read the blogazine, which is now free. Join the free blog that we have, or support the movement by purchasing some conservative apparel. Wear your conservatism with pride. Stay sharp. Watch the manipulative language, and don't let anybody tell you that restoring order is the same thing as losing freedom. We'll see you next time.